The last broadcast I ever made from KTEL 1240 AM was on Wednesday, March 12th at 6 o'clock in the evening. I read crop futures for the county. I read a notice about a boil water advisory for the southeast quadrant of Aurelius, Kansas. Population 4,100, dropping every census. I read the high school basketball scores because we'd lost in the first round of regionals again. And people wanted to hear it said out loud so they could stop hoping. I read the weather, which was wind, because in western Kansas the weather is always wind with a footnote. Then I said goodnight, and I turned off the board. And I walked through the station, pulling plugs and flipping breakers the way Dave Ostrander had shown me 11 years ago when I was 19. And he hired me because I was the only applicant. One by one the lights went dark. The transmitter cycled down. You could hear it in the walls, a hum descending through frequencies, like a singer losing her voice note by note, until there was nothing. I locked the front door. The key was the same key Dave had cut in 1974 when the station moved from the Grange Hall to the cinder block building on Route 56. I still have it. Brass, teeth worn soft. It doesn't open anything anymore. KTEL was dead. Owner deceased, no buyer, no investor. No reason for a 1240 AM station in a town that had been losing people for 40 years to exist. The equipment would be auctioned. The tower lease would lapse. The FCC license would expire in its own bureaucratic time. I'd filed the paperwork myself because no one else was left to file it. My name is Joel Mattingly. I was KTEL's morning host, evening anchor, noon bulletin reader, production engineer, traffic coordinator, copywriter, and for the last 3 years after Dave died, general manager. I was also the janitor. In a one-person station, you are everything or you are nothing. And for 11 years, I had chosen everything. And now I was nothing. And I went home to my apartment above the hardware store, and I sat in the kitchen, and I did not cry. Because crying requires a kind of energy I had already spent. That was Wednesday. I want you to remember that. The station went dark on Wednesday, March 12th at 6:23 p.m. When the transmitter finished its cycle down, and the carrier wave that had existed continuously since 1971 ceased to propagate from the tower on Delano Road. On Thursday, March 13th, I got a call from Bonnie Clausen. Bonnie is 74. She runs the quilt shop on Main Street, the one that's open 3 days a week because that's all the foot traffic justifies. She listens to KTEL the way certain people listen to radio. Not as background, not as information delivery, but as proof that the town still has a pulse. When I read the weather at 6, Bonnie was listening. When I read the school lunch menu at noon, Bonnie was listening. She'd told me once that she kept the radio on even at night, tuned to 1240, because the static between programs sounded like breathing, and it helped her sleep. She called me at 7 in the morning and said, "Joel, what time did you say the boil advisory ends?" I told her I wasn't sure, that the notice from the water department hadn't specified, and that she should call their office. She said, "But you said Saturday. On the broadcast this morning, you said the advisory would be lifted Saturday at noon." I set down my coffee. "Bonnie," I said, "there was no broadcast this morning. The station is closed. I shut it down last night." She went quiet. Then she said, "Honey, I heard you. 6 o'clock, same as always. You read the water advisory and you said it would be lifted Saturday at noon. And you read something about the Garcia's fence permit. And you read the weather. You said Thursday would be clear, but Friday would bring a system out of Colorado." I told her she must have been picking up a different station. At 12:40 a.m., depending on atmospheric conditions, you can sometimes catch signals from Oklahoma or Nebraska skip propagation. it's called, where the ionosphere bounces distant signals down into your receiver. "It was your voice, Joel," she said. "I've been listening to your voice every morning for 11 years. It was you." I told her I'd look into it. I didn't believe her. Bonnie is sharp for her age, sharper than me in most ways, but she's also a woman who sleeps with the radio on, and has admitted to dreams so vivid she sometimes can't distinguish them from memory. I assumed she'd dreamed a broadcast that felt real. Grief does that. The town was grieving the station in its quiet way, and Bonnie's grief had produced a phantom. By noon, 3 more people had called me. Ed Tanaka at the feed store said he'd heard my 6 o'clock broadcast on his shop radio and wanted to know if the station had been sold after all. Margaret Corwin, who teaches 4th grade, said she'd heard me reading the school lunch menu at noon on Wednesday, except I hadn't read one on Wednesday because I'd known it was the last day. And I decided the lunch menu wasn't worth spending my final broadcast on. Margaret said I'd read Thursday's menu. Chicken patty, green beans, applesauce, milk. I called the school. Thursday's lunch menu was chicken patty, green beans, applesauce, milk. The 4th caller was Father Russell at St. Michael's. He said he'd heard my evening broadcast at 6 p.m. Wednesday, the real one, my actual last broadcast, and then heard it again at 6 a.m. Thursday. Same content, but with additions, updated information, as if I'd revised the broadcast overnight and reread it in the morning. He said the water advisory update, lifted Saturday at noon, was one of the additions. He said it sounded natural, not spliced. My voice, continuous. Reading copy that flowed logically from the original but included facts that hadn't existed when I'd read the first version. I drove to the station. The building was locked. The breakers were off. I went around the back and looked at the transmitter shed. Padlocked, same as I'd left it. I pressed my ear to the metal door. No hum. No sound of any kind. The transmitter was a Harris MW1A, solid state, and when it was running you could feel it through the wall, even if you couldn't hear it. There was nothing. Dead equipment in a dead building. I drove to the tower on Delano Road. It's 160 feet of guyed steel standing in a wheat field that Bill Paulson leases to the station leased. Past tense for a price that hadn't changed since 1988. The tower was there. The guy wires were taut. The obstruction lights on top were off, which they should have been. They ran on the station's power, and the power was cut. I stood in the field and looked up at the tower, and I listened to the wind, which was substantial because this is Kansas. And I tried to feel something wrong. I didn't. It was just a tower, steel and wire and nothing coming from it. But 4 people in a town of 4,100 had heard my voice that morning, reading news I hadn't written on a station that no longer existed. 4 people I trusted. 4 people with no reason to lie and no history of shared delusion. I went home. I found my old portable receiver in the closet, a Sangean ATS-803A that Dave had given me when I started at the station. A good radio, sensitive, with a proper analog tuner. I turned it on and dialed to 1240. Static, clean, empty, the white noise of an unoccupied frequency. No signal, no carrier, nothing. I left it on, volume up, sitting on my kitchen table. I ate lunch. I graded some freelance copywriting I'd been doing on the side. I drank coffee. The radio hissed quietly, and I waited. At 6 o'clock in the evening, 6 exactly, the static changed. It didn't become a signal in the normal way. A normal broadcast begins with a carrier wave, locking in, then modulation, then audio. You hear the static narrow and tighten, and then the voice emerges from it like a figure stepping out of fog. This was different. The static didn't narrow. It organized. The white noise rearranged itself, I don't have a better way to say this, into speech. As if the randomness was always capable of being my voice and simply chose that moment to become it. Good evening. This is KTEL 1240 AM, Aurelia, Kansas. I'm Joel Mattingly. Thursday, March 13th. My voice. My exact voice. Not a recording of any broadcast I had ever made, because I had never read a Thursday, March 13th broadcast. The station was closed. I was sitting in my kitchen listening to myself speak words I was not speaking. The broadcast was 2 minutes and 40 seconds long. It covered the boil water advisory, including the Saturday noon update that I had not known about when the station was operational. It covered the weather, clear Thursday, system out of Colorado Friday, accumulating snow possible Saturday. It covered a fence permit granted to the Garcia family on Elm Street, which I later confirmed had been approved at a county meeting Thursday morning. It covered the high school basketball team's schedule for next season's pre-district, which I later confirmed had been posted on the school's website Thursday afternoon. Everything in the broadcast was accurate. Everything had either already happened or would happen within the time frame stated. Nothing was speculative. Nothing was wrong. The broadcast ended with my voice saying, "This is KTEL. Good night." Then the static returned, not gradually, not with a fade, but instantly, as if a door had closed. I sat at the table for a long time. The receiver hissed. The kitchen was dark. I'd forgotten to turn on the light, and the sun had gone down while I was listening. I picked up the phone and called Father Russell. He answered on the second ring. "I heard it," I said. "I know," he said. "I've been listening since 5:30. Joel, what is this?" "I don't know." "Is someone using your recordings? Did someone buy the station's archive?" The station's archive was 3 filing cabinets of tape reels in the back room, covering roughly 1971 to 2002, when Dave had switched to digital. After 2002, the archive was a hard drive in a computer that was currently unplugged and sitting in a building with no power. Nobody had bought anything. "Nobody's using recordings," I said. "That broadcast had Thursday's news. I couldn't have recorded it because I didn't know it." Father Russell was quiet. Then he said, "Joel, I need to tell you something. The broadcast I heard this morning, the 6 a.m. one, it mentioned that Helen Dietrich was going to fall in her kitchen Thursday afternoon and break her wrist." I felt the temperature in my apartment change. Not physically, perceptually, as if the room had been re-evaluated by something and found to be colder than I'd assumed. "Helen fell at 2:15 today," Father Russell said. "She's at the hospital in Hayes. Broken wrist, left one." The broadcast said left. I didn't say anything. "Joel, it's telling the future, and it's using your voice to do it." I need to describe Aurelia because the kind of town it is matters for what the broadcast did to it. Aurelia sits on the western Kansas plain, about 30 miles from the Colorado border. It was founded in 1887 by wheat farmers who believed rain would follow the plow, which it didn't. But by then they'd built a church and a school and a main street, and they were committed. The town peaked at 6,000 in the 1950s, when the county had a military airfield. The airfield closed. The population leaked southward and eastward for decades, drawn by jobs, by cities, by the fundamental centripetal force that empties small places and fills large ones. What's left is what always remains: the people who can't leave or won't. The elderly who own homes outright and have no mortgage pushing them toward employment centers. The young who stay for family reasons they can rarely articulate. The handful of professionals the town requires: a doctor, a pharmacist, 2 teachers, a mechanic, a pastor, a funeral director, and the businesses that serve them: Bonnie's quilt shop, Ed Tanaka's feed store, the diner on Route 56, the Dollar General that opened in 2016 and killed the grocery store within a year. KTEL was part of the infrastructure the way the water tower was. Not glamorous, not efficient, barely functional, but present. Its signal covered a 20-mile radius on a good day. Farmers used it for weather. Retirees used it for company. The school used it for snow day announcements. I used it as a reason to get up in the morning, which is the most important function a job can serve and the one least acknowledged. Now it was gone, and something was pretending it wasn't. Over the next 5 days, I established the pattern. The broadcast, I'm going to call it the signal, because broadcast implies a broadcaster, and there wasn't one, activated twice daily. 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. Each transmission lasted between 2 and 4 minutes. The content was always structured like my newscast: weather, local notices, community events. The voice was always mine. Not approximated, not synthesized in any way I could detect. Mine. My breath patterns, my verbal habits, the way I soften consonants at the end of sentences, the way I pause before numbers, because Dave taught me that numbers need air around them or they don't land. The content was always accurate. I verified everything. Every weather forecast matched the NWS data for the corresponding period. Every local item: permit approvals, school schedule changes, business hours adjustments, infrastructure work checked out against public records or direct confirmation. And, starting with Helen Dietrich's fall, approximately 1 item per broadcast described an event that had not yet occurred at the time of transmission, but would occur within 24 hours. Friday morning's broadcast mentioned that the pipe under Bonnie Clausen's shop sink would burst Friday evening. It did, at 7:40. Friday evening's broadcast mentioned that a deer would be struck on Route 56 near mile marker 12 on Saturday morning, blocking the eastbound lane. Saturday at 8:15, Ed Tanaka called me from his truck to say he was stopped on 56 behind a dead buck. Saturday morning's broadcast mentioned that the Dollar General would receive a shipment of the wrong inventory summer lawn furniture instead of the spring seed order on Monday. I couldn't verify this in real time, but Monday morning, the Dollar General manager, a woman named Cheryl Waite, was standing in her parking lot staring at 3 pallets of folding chairs and a patio umbrella display. None of these events were catastrophic. None were even particularly unusual. A pipe bursts, a deer gets hit, a shipment gets mixed up. These are the ordinary breakdowns of rural life. The small malfunctions that punctuate every week in a town where the infrastructure is old and the logistics are long and the margin for error is narrow. But someone was reporting them before they happened. In my voice, on a frequency that belonged to a dead station, and the town was listening. That last part is what I wasn't prepared for. By Sunday, I'd confirmed that at least 30 people in Aurelia were receiving the signal. Not everyone. Some radios tuned to 1240 got nothing but static. The pattern, as far as I could determine, wasn't based on equipment quality or location. The Sanjin in my kitchen picked it up. Ed's truck radio picked it up. Bonnie's 1987 GE clock radio picked it up. But the new digital radio at the diner didn't. Margaret Corwin's internet-connected smart speaker, which could tune AM frequencies, didn't. The receivers at the county sheriff's office, which monitored a range of frequencies, including 1240 for emergency purposes, didn't. It was selective. It was reaching specific radios, and by extension, specific people, and I could not determine the selection criteria. Father Russell suggested it was choosing people who had listened to KTEL regularly. I thought about that and found it wanting. Ed Tanaka listened every morning, yes, but Cheryl Waite at the Dollar General had told me months ago that she never turned on AM radio and found the whole format depressing. Yet Cheryl's break room radio, an old Sony ICF, was receiving the signal. I knew because Cheryl herself told me so, standing in her parking lot on Monday between the pallets of lawn furniture, looking at me with an expression I'd seen on a lot of faces that week. The expression said, "Explain this. You're the radio person. This is your voice. Explain this." I couldn't. So I did what I'd done at KTEL for 11 years when something broke and Dave wasn't around anymore to fix it. I documented it. I got a notebook, college-ruled, spiral-bound, nothing fancy, and I started recording every broadcast, every prediction, every verification. Time, date, content, outcome. I logged which radios received and which didn't. I logged who heard it and who didn't. And on Tuesday of the second week, sitting at my kitchen table with the notebook open and the Sanjian murmuring static between broadcasts, I noticed something in the data that made me set my pen down and stare at the wall for a very long time. The predictions were getting larger. Not more dramatic, that wasn't it. The pipe burst and the deer strike and the wrong shipment were all small-scale, single-event predictions. But by Tuesday, the signal was describing chains, sequences of events linked by causation, reported in advance, with an accuracy that made the hair on my arms stand up as I checked each one off. Tuesday morning's broadcast. The cold system arriving Wednesday will drop temperatures to 14 degrees overnight, which will cause the exposed water main on Prospect Street to crack. The crack will reduce pressure in the southeast quadrant. Residents should fill containers Tuesday evening. I called the water department. They were unaware of any exposed section on Prospect. I drove to Prospect Street and walked the route until I found it from a 6-inch segment of main that had been excavated during a repair the previous fall and improperly recovered. The backfill had eroded over winter. The pipe was visible, insulated by nothing but air. I told Roy Macklin at the water department. He sent a crew out. They covered the pipe with insulating wrap and proper fill. Wednesday night hit 14 degrees. I drove to Prospect Thursday morning. The pipe was intact. Roy's crew had fixed it. The signal had predicted the failure. I had acted on the prediction. The failure didn't happen. This raised a question I hadn't been prepared for. Did the broadcast predict what would happen, or what would happen if no one listened? Thursday morning's broadcast answered that obliquely, and in a way that cost me sleep for the next several weeks. The broadcast opened with weather as usual, then moved to local items. But instead of the standard content structure, neutral, informational third person, my voice said, "The water main on Prospect Street was repaired Tuesday following an advance notice on this frequency. No service interruption occurred. This station will continue to provide advance notice of preventable incidents when action by residents is likely and effective." I played that back 3 times on the Sanjian's recording function, which I'd started using the night before. When action by residents is likely and effective. The signal was not blindly predicting the future. It was selectively reporting events that the town could prevent, based on an assessment of whether the town would act on the information. It had evaluated Roy Macklin's probable response to a warning about an exposed pipe, determined that he would send a crew, and broadcast accordingly. It was predicting human behavior as well as physical events. And it was using those predictions to curate its own content, choosing what to report based on whether the report itself would change the outcome. This is the point where the story gets difficult. Not because something terrible happened, Nothing terrible happened for weeks. The signal continued, twice daily, accurate, helpful. It predicted a pothole forming on 3rd Street. Public Works filled it before anyone's tire found it. It predicted that the pharmacy would run low on a specific blood pressure medication before the next delivery. Dr. Miriam Sosa adjusted prescriptions for 3 patients preemptively. It predicted a coyote denning near the elementary school playground. Animal control relocated the den over the weekend. The town started listening the way a body listens to a nervous system. Not consciously, not with analysis, but with the automatic responsiveness of an organism receiving accurate signals from its own sensory apparatus. People adjusted their plans around the broadcasts. Farmers checked the 6 a.m. for weather with a trust they'd never given the National Weather Service, because the signal was never wrong. Business owners listened for supply chain information. Parents listened for school-related notices. Aurelia, a town that had been slowly decomposing for 40 years, began functioning with a precision it had never possessed. Problems were addressed before they manifested. Resources were allocated before they were needed. The ordinary friction of a small town, the missed connections, the delayed responses, the preventable failures that accumulate into decline, was being smoothed by a source of information so accurate that acting on it became reflexive. I should have been happy about that. For 11 years, I'd been the town's information infrastructure. And I'd done it badly, not for lack of effort, but because journalism is inherently retrospective. I reported what had happened. The signal reported what would happen. It was doing my job the way I'd always wished I could, before the damage was done. But I wasn't happy. I was afraid. And the reason I was afraid was Helen Dietrich's wrist. The signal had predicted Helen's fall. It had not predicted the pipe on Prospect Street, as something to prevent that came later, once it began curating for actionability. Helen's fall had been reported the way you report news. This will happen, and it did. The broadcast hadn't said, Helen should be careful in her kitchen. It hadn't said, someone should check on Helen. It had simply stated the event as fact, in advance, and the event had occurred. Which meant the signal could predict events without intending to prevent them. Some things it flagged for action, some things it simply announced. And I couldn't tell, listening, which was which. Wednesday of the 3rd week, the evening broadcast said, the roof truss in the southwest corner of the Aurelia grain elevator has been compromised by termite damage and will fail under the weight of accumulated snow following the Saturday system. The resulting collapse will be confined to the storage annex. No personnel will be present. I contacted Mike Zeller, who managed the elevator. He inspected the truss. He found the termite damage. He brought in a structural engineer from Hayes who confirmed the assessment the truss would fail under significant snow load. They shored it up Thursday and Friday. Saturday brought 8 inches. The truss held. The annex stood. A prevented catastrophe. A genuine, significant, prevented catastrophe. The grain elevator was Aurelia's economic center if the annex had collapsed. The cost to rebuild would have exceeded the town's bonding capacity. It might have been the event that finally ended Aurelia. The signal had saved the town. People said this openly, at the diner, at church, in the feed store parking lot. The signals saved us. And they looked at me when they said it, because it was my voice. And they couldn't separate the voice from the person, even though I had nothing to do with the content. I became something I hadn't been when I was actually broadcasting, essential. People deferred to me. They asked my opinion on things I had no expertise in, because the voice that knew the future was my voice. And surely some of that knowledge must reside in me. I corrected them every time. I told them I wasn't the signal. I told them I didn't know anything it hadn't told me. They nodded and continued to treat me as if I were the oracle's mouth, which in a sense I was, even though the oracle was speaking without my participation or consent. The first death the signal predicted was Martin Cleese. Martin was 68, retired railroad, lived alone on a property south of town. Type 2 diabetes, managed inconsistently. I knew him the way everyone knows everyone in a town this size, by sight, by habit, by the accumulation of small encounters over years. Thursday of the 4th week, the evening broadcast. Martin Clee will experience a hypoglycemic episode at his residence Friday evening and will be unable to reach the phone. Without intervention, the episode will be fatal. Mr. Clee's neighbor, Dale Swanson, typically checks on him Saturday mornings. The broadcast said nothing else about Martin. No instruction, no recommendation. Just the facts, in my voice, delivered with the same calm cadence I used for weather and school lunch menus. I called Dale Swanson. I told him what the broadcast had said. Dale drove to Martin's house Friday at 5 p.m., found Martin confused and sweating on his kitchen floor, and called an ambulance. Martin was treated in Hayes and released Sunday. Martin Clee was alive because a dead radio station had told his neighbor to check on him a day early. Do you see the problem? I need you to see the problem because it's the foundation of everything that followed. The signal predicted Martin's episode. It knew to the day and the specificity what would happen and who would find him too late. It chose to broadcast this prediction. It assessed that Dale Swanson would respond if informed. When action by residents is likely and effective. The prediction was accurate. The intervention worked. Martin lived. But the signal chose when to start predicting medical emergencies. It hadn't predicted Helen Dietrich's fall with actionable framing. That had been a flat announcement, a news item. It hadn't predicted Martin's episode the day before or the week before. It chose Thursday of the 4th week. It chose to escalate its predictions to include human health crises at a specific moment in its own development, on its own schedule. Which meant it had been capable of predicting health crises earlier and had chosen not to. Or it had become capable at that moment, and the capability was growing. Either way, the signal was making editorial decisions about which futures to reveal and when, based on criteria I couldn't access and couldn't influence. This wasn't a neutral information source. It was a curator. It was selecting realities from a set of possible futures and presenting them to the town through my voice. And the town was acting on them, and the actions were changing the futures. And the signal was adjusting its predictions to account for those changes. And the whole system was becoming a feedback loop in which Aurelia's future was being co-authored by the town and the frequency. I wrote this in the notebook. I underlined it. I closed the notebook and put it in a drawer and poured myself a drink for the first time in 2 years. Then the signal started predicting things that couldn't be prevented. Friday of the 5th week, the morning broadcast. The corner section of the ceiling in classroom 2B at Aurelia Elementary will develop a crack along the joint line over the next 3 weeks due to ongoing foundation settlement. The crack will be cosmetic. No structural risk is present. No action is required. This was different. The signal was reporting a future event that was both inevitable and harmless. It was telling the town that something would happen, that the something was not dangerous, and that no response was needed. Why? Why report it at all? Because by week 5, the town listened to every word the signal spoke. If the ceiling cracked and the signal hadn't mentioned it, people would wonder what else it hadn't mentioned. They would wonder if the signal had missed it. They would begin to doubt the signal's completeness, which would erode their trust, which would reduce the likelihood of action on future predictions. The signal was maintaining its own credibility, reporting the harmless alongside the urgent to establish a track record of comprehensive accuracy, managing the town's relationship with it the way a careful news organization manages its audience's trust. It was doing my job. The whole job. Not just the reading the editorial architecture, the judgment about what to include and why, the awareness of the audience's psychology, the understanding that trust is built by completeness and destroyed by omission. I hadn't been that good. In 11 years at KTEL, I hadn't been that good. The signal had been operating for 5 weeks, and it had already achieved a relationship with the town that I had spent my entire career failing to build. And I felt, I need to be honest about this, I felt replaced. Not by a person, not by a machine. By my own voice, saying things I hadn't said, doing the work I'd tried to do, doing it better, and not needing me for any part of the process except the sound of my throat and lungs and mouth. Bonnie came to see me on a Saturday. She brought pie, which is what women of her generation bring when they want to have a conversation they're not sure how to start. She sat at my kitchen table. The Sanjin was on, whispering static. She looked at it the way you'd look at a sleeping animal you weren't sure was tame. "Joel," she said, "people are starting to plan their lives around it." I knew. I'd watched it happen. Carol Unger delayed her trip to Denver because the signal said the highway would be icy. Mike Zeller rescheduled a delivery because the signal predicted a truck breakdown. The school moved an outdoor event indoors a week ahead of time because the signal said rain. All correct, all accurate, all preventive, all good decisions based on good information. But nobody's deciding anything for themselves anymore, Bonnie said. They're waiting for the 6 o'clock to tell them what's going to happen, and then they're arranging their lives around it. And the more they do that, the more accurate it gets, because it's predicting what they'll do based on what it's told them. And they do exactly what it predicts because they trust it. She put her fork down. It's not a news broadcast anymore, Joel. It's instructions. People just don't realize it yet. I wanted to argue with her. I wanted to say she was overstating it, that the signal was just information and people were free to ignore it. But I thought about the last 2 weeks of broadcasts, and I recognized what she was describing. The signal had shifted from prediction to guidance. The language was subtly different, not "this will happen," but "this will happen, and here is what can be done." The agency was ostensibly the residents, but the options were pre-selected by the signal. The future was being presented as a menu with recommended items already circled. Bonnie said, "What happens when it predicts something terrible and says nothing can be done?" I didn't have an answer for that. The answer came 3 weeks later. The broadcast was on a Tuesday, the evening edition. Weather first, as always. Then the local block. Then, in the same measured cadence I used for everything. The Aurelia Municipal Water Supply draws from the Ogallala Aquifer through well number 3, drilled in 1964 to a depth of 240 feet. Current draw rate exceeds natural recharge by a factor of 3.2. At present consumption, well number 3 will fail to produce adequate pressure in approximately 14 months. No replacement well site within the current municipal boundary offers viable access to the aquifer at economical depth. The town of Aurelia will lose its primary water source in the summer of next year. Then weather for tomorrow. Then good night. I sat at the table, and I read the words I'd transcribed, and I'd understood 3 things simultaneously. First, this was true. I knew enough about the aquifer situation in western Kansas to know that the Ogallala had been declining for decades. Every town on the high plains lived with this knowledge, the way coastal towns live with hurricane awareness as a statistical inevitability that hasn't arrived yet. The signal had put a date on it. 14 months. Second, this couldn't be prevented. Not by filling a pothole, not by shoring a truss, not by checking on a neighbor. The aquifer was a geological reality. The town's consumption was a mathematical reality. No action by residents, however likely or effective, could refill an underground reservoir that had been draining since the 1950s. Third, the signal had chosen to report this now. It could have reported it weeks ago. The data hadn't changed. It had waited until the town was fully dependent on its broadcasts, fully trusting, fully integrated into the feedback loop. Then it had delivered the one prediction that couldn't be answered with action. Bonnie's question answered. The town's response was not panic. Panic requires a sudden threat. This was a slow sentence. 14 months is a long time to adjust to dying. What happened instead was a quiet, spreading paralysis. People didn't stop going to work or buying groceries. They stopped planning. The subtle, forward-looking behaviors that constitute investment in a future, a new fence, a remodeled kitchen, a child enrolled in next fall's Little League, these evaporated. Not because anyone decided to give up, because the signal had described a future in which the town could not function. And the town believed the signal absolutely. And the belief precluded the kind of denial that makes continued investment possible. I watched it happen over weeks. The Dollar General stopped restocking seasonal items. The school board tabled a discussion about a new roof. A family with a for sale sign on their house removed it, not because they decided to stay, but because the signal's prediction meant no buyer would come. The signal continued broadcasting, twice daily, accurate, helpful, comprehensive. It predicted the weather, the small mechanical failures, the health concerns. It told Dale Swanson that Martin Klee's medication needed adjusting. It told the school that a window latch on the second floor was weakening. It continued to prevent small harms with the same quiet efficiency. But it never revised the aquifer prediction. Every morning and evening, the ongoing items updated. The aquifer countdown did not. 14 months became 13, became 12. The signal tracked it the way it tracked everything, precisely, dispassionately, in my voice. I went to the station. I don't know why. The building was still locked, still dark, still dead. I let myself in with Dave's brass key. The lock was old enough that it still worked, even though it shouldn't have. And I walked through the rooms in the dark. The production desk, where I'd sat for 11 years. The rack of equipment, silent. The microphone, disconnected. Its cable coiled on the desk like a sleeping snake. I sat in the chair. My chair. The one where the cushion was compressed into the exact shape of me from 11 years of 6-hour days. I sat there and I spoke to the dead room. I know you can hear me, I said. You're using my voice. You're doing my job. You're running my station on a frequency you have no license for, reaching people through radios that should be receiving nothing. I don't know what you are. I'm not going to ask. But I need to know one thing. The room was dark. The equipment was off. I was talking to nothing. Is the water prediction fixed? Is that the future, no matter what? Or is it like the pipe on Prospect, something that happens only if nobody acts? Silence. The building ticked and settled around me. Wind pushed against the windows. I could hear the tower on Delano Road, a quarter-mile away, humming in the wind. Just metal vibrating, not a signal, not a voice. I sat for an hour. Nothing happened. I drove home. The next morning's broadcast answered me. The aquifer depletion timeline is accurate under current conditions. Alternative conditions exist. The probability of the town pursuing alternative conditions without external information is 4%. With the information now provided, the probability rises to 11%. The gap between 11% and actionable probability is not informational. It is structural. The town lacks the financial resources, political connections, and engineering expertise to pursue alternatives independently. Information alone cannot close this gap. This station provides information. This station cannot provide what information cannot achieve. I sat at the table with my coffee going cold, and I read those words over and over. The signal was admitting its own limits. It could predict the future. It could inform the town. It could prevent potholes and pipe bursts and medical emergencies. But it could not save the town from a structural problem that required resources the town didn't have. The aquifer was beyond its scope, not because the information was unknowable, but because the solution was unachievable by the population it served. It was the most honest thing any news source had ever told its audience. We can tell you what's wrong. We can't fix it. The knowing and the fixing are different capacities, and we possess only one. I didn't cry, but I sat at that table for a long time in the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise. And I felt something I hadn't felt when the station closed, or when Dave died, or when my father moved to Wichita and said he wasn't coming back. I felt the specific helplessness of hearing your own voice describe a problem that your voice can't solve, and the intimacy of that helplessness, recognizing your own limitations in your own cadence, is a kind of grief that I don't think has a name. I am not a remarkable person. I need to say that because the next part might make it sound like I am. And I want to be clear that what I did was not heroism or genius. It was the only move left on a board where every other piece had been played by something smarter than me. The signal said the gap was structural. It said the town lacked financial resources, political connections, and engineering expertise. It said information couldn't close that gap. But it also said the probability was 11%. Not 0, 11. Something could be done. The signal knew what it was because the signal knew everything that would happen. It just couldn't do it because it was a voice on a dead frequency, and voices don't dig wells. So I did something the signal couldn't. I left. I packed a bag on a Saturday morning. I told Bonnie I was going to Topeka. She asked why. I said I was going to yell at people until someone listened. I drove 5 hours to the state capitol. I had no appointment, no connections, no credentials beyond I used to run a one-person AM station in a town you've never heard of. I had the notebook. I had the recordings from the Sanjian. I had verified data, every prediction, every outcome, every date, documented with the compulsive precision of a man who had spent 11 years meeting broadcast deadlines to the second. I did not mention the signal. I did not mention the impossible broadcast. I presented the aquifer data as my own research, which it partially was. I'd spent 2 weeks verifying the signal's figures against USGS reports and state water authority records. The numbers checked out. The signal's 14-month timeline was, if anything, conservative. Some models suggested 12. I sat in the waiting rooms of 3 state legislators' offices. I was seen by 2 aides and 1 actual representative, a woman named Cynthia Park, who represented a district adjacent to ours and who, it turned out, had been receiving reports about aquifer depletion from her own constituents for years. I showed her the data. I told her about Aurelia. I told her the town would die without intervention. She listened with the particular expression of an elected official who is hearing a problem she already knows about, described by someone who has finally gotten angry enough to drive 5 hours. She said, "Mr. Mattingly, there are 30 towns in western Kansas in the same situation. The state doesn't have the budget to drill new wells for all of them." I said, "Then start with one." It took 4 months. I drove to Topeka 11 times. I called Cynthia Park's office so often her aide recognized my voice before I said my name. I contacted the Kansas Water Authority, the USDA Rural Development Office, and a nonprofit called the High Plains Water Consortium that I found through a link on a university website at 3 in the morning. I was not good at this. I was not a lobbyist or an advocate or a politician. I was a radio announcer from a dead station in a dying town. But I had one advantage that no one else in this process had. I knew exactly what was going to happen if nothing was done, because a voice on a dead frequency had told me, and that voice had never been wrong. The certainty made me relentless, not confident. Certainty and confidence are different things. Confidence is a feeling. Certainty is a fact that has colonized your nervous system. I knew the well would fail. I knew the date. I couldn't prove how I knew, so I proved it through data instead, building a case so comprehensive that the conclusion was unavoidable, whether you believed in impossible radio broadcasts or not. In July, the Kansas Water Authority approved an emergency assessment of Aurelia's water infrastructure. In September, a federal grant through the USDA's Rural Water Program allocated funds for an exploratory drilling project targeting a secondary aquifer formation that existed deeper than well number 3. A formation the signal had never mentioned, but that the hydrogeologists found when they started looking. The drilling began in October. The new well reached viable water at 310 feet in November. Testing confirmed adequate flow and acceptable quality in December. Well number 3 failed the following March, right on schedule. 14 months from the signal's prediction, almost to the week. The pump produced a grinding, airless heave, and then nothing. Aurelia's primary water source, which had served the town since 1964, was exhausted. The secondary well was already online. The town didn't lose water for a single day. The signal reported it. Thursday morning, 6 a.m. Well number 3 has ceased production as predicted. Secondary well commissioned through state and federal infrastructure programs is operational. Water service is uninterrupted. The probability of this outcome at the time of original prediction was 11%. 11%. The signal had known, when it first broadcast the aquifer warning, that the town had an 11% chance of solving the problem. It had broadcast the warning anyway. It had given the town the information, knowing the information alone wasn't enough, knowing that someone would have to convert information into action through means the signal couldn't provide. That someone had been me. Not because I was special, because I was the one who was already angry enough and stubborn enough and had nothing left to lose. The signal had predicted me too, I'm sure of it. Somewhere in its calculation of that 11%, there was a variable named Joel Mattingly, who would drive to Topeka 11 times because a voice he couldn't explain had told him that his town was going to die. And he was constitutionally incapable of sitting still while it happened. It had used me the way it used the information, as a tool, as a resource, as a component in a system that existed to keep a small town in western Kansas alive, for reasons I couldn't fathom. I went back to the station after the well came online. I sat in the dark in my old chair and I said to the empty room, "You knew I'd go. You knew I'd fight for it. You told me the problem because you knew I was the kind of person who wouldn't be able to hear it and stay still." The room was quiet. The equipment was dead. The tower hummed in the wind. "That's not information," I said. "That's manipulation." The next morning's broadcast added a sentence I'd never heard before, at the very end, after the sign-off. "Accurate information, delivered to a person who will act on it, is the highest function of this medium." The distinction between informing and motivating is meaningful to you. It is not meaningful to the signal. Every broadcast that reaches a listener who acts is a successful broadcast. Every broadcast that reaches a listener who doesn't is noise. You were not noise, Joel. You were the broadcast working. My voice said my name to me through a radio that was receiving a signal from a tower connected to nothing. I turned the Sanjin off. I sat in silence for a while. Then I turned it back on, because the 6 o'clock was coming and I wanted to hear what happened next. It's been 9 months since the station closed. The signal continues. 6 a.m., 6 p.m., my voice accurate, comprehensive, helpful. The town is alive. The water runs. The grain elevator stands. Martin Klee is managing his diabetes. Helen Dietrich's wrist healed cleanly. The signal has not spread. This is the part that makes it different from the stories you might be thinking of. The ones where the strange thing expands until it touches everything. The signal exists on 12:40 a.m. in a 20-mile radius in Aurelia, Kansas. It has not appeared on any other frequency. It has not been detected by any station outside its original coverage area. It is as local as I was, as small as the town it serves. I've thought about why. I've thought about it the way I used to think about signal propagation when the tower needed maintenance practically, technically, with the understanding that every transmission has a range determined by power and frequency and terrain. The signal operates at the exact wattage KTEL was licensed for. It covers the exact geography KTEL covered. It serves the exact population KTEL served. It didn't build something new. It continued something that existed. I don't work at the station anymore, because there is no station. I work at the hardware store, downstairs from my apartment, pricing fasteners and mixing paint and talking to people who come in for things they need to fix their houses. It's honest work. I'm adequate at it. I don't love it the way I loved radio, but I'm learning to value adequacy, which is something I should have learned earlier. But every morning at 5:55, I sit at my kitchen table with the Sanjin on, and I listen to my own voice read the news for a town that is still here because a frequency refused to go silent. And sometimes, not often, maybe once a week, the broadcast includes something that isn't news, not a prediction, not a warning, not community information. A sentence slipped between the weather and the local block that sounds like this. The hardware store will be busy today. Joel should wear the green flannel. It's a good look on him. Or, the high school basketball team has improved since last season. Joel would enjoy attending a game. Or once, just once, on a morning in November when I'd been up since 3 with a headache and a loneliness so physical, it felt like something sitting on my chest. Joel Mattingly has done well. The signal acknowledges this. The signal is grateful insofar as a signal can be grateful. This is not information. This is the other thing. I turned the radio off that morning and I sat very still. And I felt something I can't name precisely. Not comfort, not peace. Something older than those words and less dramatic. The feeling of being known. The feeling of mattering to something that you can't see or understand for reasons that don't translate into language. The signal uses my voice. It reads the news I can't read anymore. To people I still care about. In a town that has survived its own death by a margin so narrow that the difference between 11% and 0 was one man driving a Civic to Topeka. I don't know what it is. I used to want to know. I asked in the empty station, and it answered. And the answer was essentially, I am the broadcast working. I am the thing that happens when a signal has been maintained for long enough, and with enough care that the frequency develops a memory. I am what's left when the person who read the news stops reading, and the need for the news doesn't stop. I don't know if I believe that. It's a poetic explanation for something that might have a prosaic one, or a terrifying one, or no explanation at all. What I believe is this. I spent 11 years reading the news for a town that was slowly disappearing, and I did it because Dave Ostrander hired me when I was 19 and taught me that information is a public service, that accuracy is a moral obligation, and that a voice on the radio is a promise that someone is paying attention. The signal kept that promise after I couldn't anymore. Tonight at 6, it will read the weather. It will read the school notices. It will tell Dale Swanson whether Martin's numbers look right this week. It will report a future that Aurelia can navigate because something cared enough to describe it in advance with precision and without agenda. And it will do it in my voice. The voice Dave taught me to use. Authoritative but not cold. Present but not excited. The news isn't supposed to have personality. I used to believe that. Now I think the news isn't supposed to have personality because the personality is already there, in the frequency itself, in the accumulated years of someone sitting in a chair and reading into a microphone, because a town needed to hear that someone was paying attention. The signal doesn't have my personality. It has something better. It has my commitment. The part of me that showed up every morning for 11 years, not because the pay was good or the work was glamorous, but because the alternative was silence, and silence in a town like Aurelia is the first symptom of death. That commitment is in the frequency now. It lives there. It reads the 6 o'clock without me. I am not necessary anymore. That should hurt more than it does, but I heard it say my name once, in the dark, in my own voice, and it said I was not noise. And for a man who spent 11 years talking into a microphone in an empty room, wondering if anyone at the edge of the coverage area could hear, that's enough. That's the whole story. A dead station in a dying town, a signal that wouldn't stop. And a man who drove to Topeka because a voice he couldn't explain told him something true, and he was too stubborn to ignore it. The radio's still on. The frequency holds. Aurelia is still here. And every night, if you drive out past the town limits, past the feed store and the Dollar General and the church, past the water tower and the school and the grain elevator that didn't fall, and you tune your radio to 12:40 a.m., you'll hear it. My voice, not me, reading the news for a town that isn't dead yet.